Hey class, how's it going? Just a couple more video lectures here. We're moving a little bit more just like closer to the present in time in this sort of journey through archaeology. And want to talk a little bit about medieval archaeology, historical archaeology. What are some of the concerns of archaeologists that work with these time periods and some of the different regions that might be covered by historical archaeology and medieval archaeology? Um, and what are some of the evidence? What are some of the interpretations of what's going on? Um, right. So one of the key things to keep in mind again is that traditionally archaeology had been sort of defined by a study of prehistory, meaning like studying populations before there was a written record. Obviously, with if you're going back all the way to Mesopotamia, as we've seen, there's some written record, and certainly in classical Rome and Greece, there's quite a bit of written record. And obviously, by the time we get into medieval period and what's generally, I mean, all of history, there is writing as well. So, what is different about the archaeology of the historical period or the medieval period than, say, history? Um, so let's talk about some of that. So just to get started, just to kind of like keep us generally abreast of what's going on in like the Western world, um, we kind of did get to our like we got to the Roman Empire and our sort of overview of the rise of the Western world. So what happens at the end of the Roman Empire? How does that sort of come to an end? Often 476 AD is just kind of seen as a general marker of when the Western Roman Empire falls. This map is a little confusing, I guess, but uh, by 476 AD, these sort of invading Germanic tribes, we'll talk about that in a second, have taken over the city of Rome and have, dismantled the Roman governmental apparatus. Now, one thing to just keep in mind, just like so you're aware of history, I guess, is that when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, what we're really talking about is the fall of the Western Roman Empire, like meaning the Roman Empire that's run out of the city of Rome. But crucially, there was the Roman Empire was divided by Constantine, um, and with a new capital in the Eastern Roman Empire over here in what is today Istanbul. This is the Byzantine sort of Eastern Roman Empire, and that lasts all the way up until the 1200s, 1300s, until eventually that's sort of sacked by um, Muslim populations that have taken over this region. Okay, so 476 AD, fall of the Western Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire, if you just want to be lazy about it. Yeah, there's the invasion of these sort of what are often called Germanic tribes. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all coming from what is today Germany. Like the modern outline of Germany is roughly like this. But a lot of these Germanic tribes are also coming from further north, like Scandinavia, like Denmark, and also sort of further east, like Poland, even places like Estonia, Latvia. And they are, as if you remember, like sort of this roughly, this colored part here is roughly like the extent of the Roman Empire. The Romans were never able to sort of make big incursions into what is today Germany or the Germanic regions, for a variety of reasons. Anyway, so there is oftentimes you'll hear about the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, some of these cool names, the Lombards, anytime you see anything named Lombardy or Lombard, that's named after another one of these Germanic tribes. So these guys are all kind of, generally sometimes referred to as barbarians, but that's a little bit of a misleading term. Uh, Barbarian often has this connotation of being sort of ruthless, uncivilized, brutes. It's just that they were sort of kind of there's basically non-Roman is more or less what it sort of stands for, barbarian. And actually, like the word barbarian, in Northern Africa, there's a group of people that are generally referred to as Berbers. And then we have this barbar. That's actually just kind of a little bit of a made up sounding word. Like, you know how today we say like blah, blah, blah. Um, that's if like we don't understand what somebody's saying or they're talking too much, we'll say like, yeah, blah blah blah. That's kind of a derogatory name. Like that is the etymology of like barbarian. It's not like something that barbarians call themselves. It's basically Romans, or even going back further to the Greeks, um, making fun of people who didn't speak Greek or Latin and calling them like blah blahs. So it's like if like today we might call them the blah blahians or something like that, blablarians. um, uh, so we talk about these Germanic tribes, and these are all they're pretty distinctly different too. I mean, the Vandals, the Lombards, the Goths, these are different entities, different sort of political units. Um, what can archaeologists say about these groups? It does seem like they do have distinct, like, sort of traditions of burial among these different Vandal groups and these different barbarian groups, these different Germanic groups. Um, Certainly, I mean, the Lombards who occupied northern Italy, they have some pretty wild sort of burial customs and traditions. The Goths as well. I mean, there's two Goths. There's the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. One's in the east, one's in the west. It's not that important. Not really gonna sort of make any quizzes about this. Um, so these are some of this like interesting sort of things that you do find in sort of doing these sort of Dark Ages or fall of the Roman Empire archaeology. Um, One thing that's interesting though about sort of this incursion of the Germanic states and sort of the takeover of the Roman Empire is that while like the Roman governing apparatus does collapse, it's not as though Roman culture and Roman society totally fades away. In fact, many of the barbarian groups or Germanic groups are actually kind of eager to adopt some of, Roman customs. And like more importantly, I mean, these barbarians, these Germanic tribes that are coming in, they are not Christians at all, but the Romans had adopted Christianity by what is it, like 370 something AD. Um, and so to some extent, despite taking over the despite destroying the like Roman Empire as a political apparatus, the Germanic groups do incorporate a lot of Roman ideas. I mean, they come to speak Latin, which is the Roman language that becomes sort of the lingua franca of all of Europe. And of course, they do adopt Christianity too. So, um, to what extent are they just sort of ruthless conquerors that are coming in and destroying a culture, or to what extent are they sort of coming in and settling and expanding their sort of territorial claims? Is a debate that people have. Um, One sort of interpretation is that these Germanic tribes who are coming in, sort of taking over the Roman, and also it's again like what the thing about the Roman Empire is it's unified. It is a unified Roman Empire that is, governed by a capital in Rome and oversees everything. One of the things that happens with the invasion of the Germanic tribes is it becomes splintered. It's not a centralized, geographic political entity anymore. You have these different sort of bands and groups that sort of take over local regions. But one of the things that I mean, it seems pretty clear that a lot of these Germanic tribes are interested in like sort of taking over like the Roman wealth and the Roman uh, infrastructure and the Roman institutions. They don't quite succeed though, is kind of the problem. They're too splintered and can't sort of unify that huge Roman governing apparatus. Um, so at least in terms of thinking about Europe or more Western Europe, if you want to, the real like seat of power begins to sort of move from like what is today Italy into what is today France. Um, these Frankish dynasties, the Merovingians and the Carolingians, come to sort of hold sway over much of the sort of France, like what is today France and German territories. Um, and with Charlemagne and the Carolingians, it kind of, you know, makes the first sort of movements towards creating an idea of what Europe is, creating like a sort of unified continent of people. Charlemagne comes into what is today Italy, northern Italy, kicks out those Lombards, sort of unites and makes an alliance with the Pope. And so you do have this sort of, Frankish, uh, sort of aristocratic, noblery based out of what is today, France, that sort of unites with the Pope and the Catholic Church, and they create this kind of something of a unified, not totally unified, and not covering all of what today we call Europe, but a kind of political apparatus that does hold a lot of sway over a lot of Europe. Okay, so sometimes this period, we've talked about the word Dark Ages before, but we've talked about sort of the Dark Ages as an idea of what you might call the fall of the post-Bronze Age collapse. Some people talk about after the Bronze Age collapse, the sort of Mediterranean sphere entered a Dark Age. Well, obviously you've heard of the Dark Ages as a term. Oftentimes usually that term is meant to reference Europe's alleged Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire and sort of before the Renaissance in, say, the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. Just to sort of revisit this idea of Dark Ages, I and many other archaeologists and historians are sort of opposed to this phrase these days because it suggests that nothing's happening. It suggests that this sort of cultural regression. It suggests that like people went backwards and got dumber and lived in poverty more so than they did before. None of that is really true. A couple things that are true is that there's less sort of unified, there's more sort of local governance and less sort of unified governance. There is less sort of aggregation and accumulation of wealth and population that's going on during this period from, say, like roughly, if you want to be really simple about it and really broad, you could call it like, you can call it like 500 AD to 1500 AD if you want to make a nice simple 1000 years out of it. I would suggest that this period ends closer to around like 1350 AD, but some people might push. There's not like a fine line of when like the Middle Ages ends and the early modern period begins. In certain regions, it's different. But a couple things that are interesting about this is I mean, it's a fairly relatively stable kind of system. Some people, will who look back on this sort of Middle Ages period as with kind of rose-colored glasses or kind of optimistically do make arguments that it's a little bit less misogynistic, a little bit less racist. Some of these terms are really hard to apply back to, say, like 700 AD, because honestly, the concept of race, as we know it today, didn't exist in 700 AD. So you could say that Europe was less racist in 700 AD, and that wouldn't be wrong necessarily, but it also is like kind of an anachronistic concept. So it's not a great, it's not a very helpful or useful framing or so. And by all means, yes, I'd be definitely willing to argue that in, say, the year like 700 or 800 AD, in Europe, Western European society, generally, broadly, there's exceptions everywhere, always, but the role of women in society is much more respected in, say, like 800 AD than it is in, say, 1600 AD. It really is around the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s that this sort of patriarchal form of society that has come to dominate the modern world is born. And it's a little bit anachronistic to sort of even think about the gender roles in, say, 800 AD, because they hadn't quite sort of solidified into what we kind of have normalized today. But I mean, I've always, if I were a time traveler and perhaps a woman time traveler, I'd much rather go to 800 AD than, say, 1500 AD, at least in Europe. The role and position of women in society did get much worse from, say, roughly 800 AD to roughly 1500 AD. It's sadly, there's not like some sort of linear trajectory where there's increasingly more sort of egalitarian and just gender roles or um, uh, you know, equality in that regard. Um, Sadly, it kind of has its ups and downs, as kind of sadly does seem to be. You can maybe apply that to today's world too, a little bit, I guess. Thinking about various debates and back and forth on the legality of women's reproductive freedom in the United States, for example. Anyway, so I mean, yeah, there is conflict, there is war, uh, but certainly it's much smaller scale. Um, uh, One of the key things that separates war in the medieval period from war, say, starting around like 1500 or 1600 AD, is that for the most part, wars or conflicts, territorial conflicts, prior to the early modern or modern period, are always fought, usually the nobles and the aristocrats versus other nobles and aristocrats. It's not really until about like 1400, 1500 that you get the conscription of lots of peasants fighting wars. Um, and of course, today, you know, nearly any wars, or certainly the world wars of the 20th century, they're fought like almost entirely by the non-aristocratic people, non-nobles. So that's a real shift. And uh, when you have a war, you're having like fights over territorial claims often, or claims over resources, and the claims that will eventually be made by the aristocrats and the nobles and the lords. So you have aristocrats fighting aristocrats for control over territory, as opposed to the wars today, where you have poor people fighting other poor people on behalf of rich people. So I'm not saying war is ever good, but I I do romanticize a little bit this idea of rich people fighting wars against other rich people in order to control things that they will eventually control, as opposed to sort of forcing poor people to fight other poor people in order for rich people to control things, if that makes sense. Um, oh, here's some just the medieval iconography is so mind blowing. I love it. It's there's if you ever want to do a Google search of like weird medieval representations of animals or pets, it's it's pretty great. Um, just some common depictions here. There's a lot has been written about sort of um different ways of seeing the world that people have read into sort of medieval paintings and representations versus Renaissance paintings and representations. If you're familiar with like art history much, in the Renaissance, there's a new aesthetic style that becomes popular called linear perspective. And whenever you see like a painting by, Michelangelo or Da Vinci or Raphael or any of those famous guys, um, that's usually done in the linear perspective style, which is meant to mimic how our eyes work. And that way of seeing the world has largely become associated with reality, quote unquote reality. Um, and during the medieval period, it's not like people couldn't do that. That kind of like perspective style was done in the Roman period too. It's not like it was just figured out around like 1400 how to paint using linear perspective. But it just was not the aesthetic style that was popular in the medieval period. The medieval period is looks more like this crazy stuff, um, which some people would argue is like indicative of how different people sort of perceived the world around them. It's a bit of a it's not really important for archaeology, but um, right. So some people do say, "Hey, I'm trying to make the case that the Dark Ages were kind of cool, actually, and then the Middle Ages were maybe better than we think." But of course, you do have this kind of indentured servitude, this kind of forced labor, this stuff we sometimes call feudalism and serfdom. Right, yeah, that's true. That existed. Um, People were forced to, give some of they were forced to work um, on the land of perhaps sometimes a feudal lord, which oftentimes is just like a friend or a relative of a king. You know, you have these vassals that like owe allegiance to the kings or the hierarchy. Um, just to like play devil's advocate a little bit on talk about like, you know, how serfdom or feudalism sort of compares to modern economic systems, right? So on the screen, you see sort of roughly like layout of the population where really like 97% of the population is kind of equals, at least in terms of socioeconomic status. And for the most part, if you are just a peasant, um, you're never really interacting with anyone that's hierarchically above you in society. And so it's true, like, you know, these clergy and these clergy definitely are a astronomically beyond you in terms of socioeconomic status, but you don't often run into the nobles, the 1%. You do interact with the clergy kind of regularly, but you never really, you know, it's not too often that the lord or lady or noble comes down and talks to the peasants. The noble is just kind of like in charge of territory. It's not even like they own it really. Um, uh, it's just like sort of like there's a king, and maybe he's got these feudal lords and these vassals that owe allegiance to him, and they're in charge of a certain amount of territory or a certain region, and they're just sort of in charge of making sure that there's no uprisings there, or you know, then the lord can more or less do whatever they want with their land, and they can sort of have various levels of sort of um, I mean, if they're a cool noble or a cool lord, it can be a pretty nice situation where the peasants can more or less have autonomy and you know, work the land as they choose. Oftentimes, you know, they do owe some amount of their agricultural output to the nobles. But that's not too much different than what we call taxes today. Um, um, you know, there's a tendency to think of peasants as, I think in the popular imagination, peasants are like really poor. We think of them as like impoverished and like dirty and like begging and like sleeping in dirt and stuff like that. I would like to counter that impression of peasants. Um, you know, some people might disagree with this, but I would suggest there's not really poverty in the medieval period. There's not really poverty until you have sort of forced wage labor. These people aren't really working for money. There's not really much money in circulation. There's not really much ownership. And when there's not, when you don't own things, the lack of having them doesn't make you impoverished. um, you know, you might own like three things. I mean, and even that concept of ownership might be a little bit anachronistic too. Like you have some clothes, probably. You might have like a, you know, you probably have a place where you live, but you might not. You don't like own it. The way it's not like you have a like a lease or a title or a mortgage or anything like that. So again, like you know, you're largely living amongst people who have of equal socioeconomic status. So there's also not that like, oh, I'm relatively impoverished to my neighbor. That doesn't really exist. And it's not like you're wanting for things. I think today when we think of poverty, we think of want. Like you go wanting for food, or you're wanting for shelter, or you're wanting for uh, clothes or something like that. That's not a condition that these people are in. So I would just generally push back against this idea that peasantry is poverty. Um, and again, like, so ostensibly, you know, these nobles are in charge of everything, but to a big extent, you know, depending on how tyrannical the noble is, um, the peasant communities can largely sort of dictate their own customs. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second when we talk about the commons. Oh, just drawing on one of the interesting articles on Blackboard. There's this concept of looking at deviant burials. This is sort of like a case study of um, archaeologists who have found uh, burials, cemeteries that exhibit curious um, patterns or tendencies. Um, so based on like the way that some, you know, corpses or skeletons are found in the burial pits or tombs, some historians, archaeologists, interpreters have like made the argument that this is evidence of a belief in something like vampires or something like witches or something like that, or certainly criminals might be buried in a different way. Um, and yeah, people have even made the argument that the way people are buried might indicate some kind of sexuality or gender difference. Um, so there is an article on Blackboard, I believe, that sort of reviews this evidence for the idea that in Eastern Europe, there is a belief in something like what we call vampires, because some of these bodies and corpses are buried with like chains around their necks, indicating that like they're afraid that they might be resurrected. And so if you put like an iron chain around their neck or shackles on them, it'll prevent them from being resurrected and coming back to haunt us. So maybe that's an indication of a belief in ghosts or zombies or vampires or something like that. Some of them are even found with like stakes driven through their heart, like with like the kind of pop culture thing that we think of when we think of vampires. Um, Corpses buried with bricks in their mouths. So these are all interesting things that you do find kind of from the medieval period and sort of um, Eastern Europe in sort of the sort of like 500 to 1000 time period, which generally is a little bit before the historical record of ideas about something like vampires arising. You know, generally like the concept of vampire, um, which is there's a lot of different ways. Vampires have been represented in many ways at various times throughout the past 1,000 years or so, but um, it doesn't really seem that there's something like closely related to what we call vampires today until around like 1200 or 1000 AD or so. Um, but certainly it does seem like if one of the things that archaeology can do is sort of provide a counter to the historical record. So if archaeology is finding these deviant burials where corpses are buried with like maybe bricks in their mouth or chains around them or shackles or some kind of stake through their heart, maybe that's telling us something about the past that history doesn't even know, something that like the historians can't determine based on their reading of texts. We archaeologists can discover based on the material remains. That's an idea. But anyway, yeah, you do see these kind of deviant burials with various things going on. Some people have interpreted them as like, yeah, some kind of belief in superstitious stuff that might be some kind of fear of like the dead people coming back to haunt us or coming back to do something bad to us, or maybe that's just how like criminals or deviants were buried, like as extra punishment or something. I don't know. um right, there is this I don't know if I put it on Blackboard actually, but there's some interesting articles about archaeologists that try to interpret, while we're on the subject of deviant burials, some archaeologists have found some burials, and the archaeologists, to their credit, don't really sort of suggest that the burials they found indicate that a male member of society was gay. Um, uh, but some popular headlines. As you can see on the screen here, there's a popular headline that says, archaeologists find quote unquote gay caveman near Prague. Um, uh, so the evidence for this, the reason that this like headline exists is really, really flimsy. Basically, uh, this like sort of male skeleton is found with domestic burial goods that are off that today, we might associate with today we might project onto the past, like women's social roles or women's labor. So this is really very thin. Let's remind ourselves that our ideas of homosexuality, as we sort of know them today, didn't really like our frames of sort of thinking about it didn't really exist until about 1850, or at least those words, homosexuality and heterosexuality. Um, People have had same-sex relationships as long as there's been people. I mean, there were, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, people are having same-sex partners, same-sex relationships. So same-sex romance or interaction has existed forever, as long as there's been humans. Um, how societies think of those has definitely changed a lot over the past 5,000 years or so. Anyway, this is an old skeleton, not a medieval skeleton. Um, And it's just maybe an interesting case study of how we interpret things. Like, again, archaeologists who maybe suggest, oh, this burial's, this corpse is buried with like shackles or it's like chained down. So maybe that's an indication that the people who buried it thought it was a vampire or a ghost or something, or could be. It's also interesting to sort of have this sometimes efforts to project back on the past some of our sexual norms and gender norms that are really out of place. I mean, no doubt about it, people 5,000 years ago in the Czech Republic, or what is it today, the Czech Republic, probably did have gender roles. The gender roles are fairly widespread, like, you know, but they're, it's even like the notion of a gender binary sometimes people talk about today. That's more of a social construct. There are even today, like, in Bangladesh and India, there's this sort of third gender concept, Hiraj. Um, uh, so yeah, I mean, there's no way that we can sort of look at a skeleton and really get a great insight into how people in Prague 5,000 years ago socially constructed gender and sexuality. But it is an interesting thing that archaeologists do sometimes in trying to interpret what we can read into burial remains and burial positions. Okay, real quick, let me just talk about one of the crazy, let me talk about the end of the world, basically. The Black Death, the plague. There's a lot of, well, I mean, this is not a history class. I don't want to just repeat the history. I want to kind of talk about it archaeologically. And there is a lot of material culture that is indicative of this period that we sometimes refer to as the Black Death between about 1347 and 1352. So if you're not familiar with the history of this is an incredibly apocalyptic event. This is kind of, I often think of this as the end of the world. Like the world ended, at least the European world ended in 1350 AD or so. Everything that's happened since then has been post-apocalyptic. You live in the post-apocalypse. That's basically what I'm saying. That the end of the world already happened. Sorry to inform you. This is a period in which at least 1/3 of the population dies in Europe. And so about 30 million people, 30 to 50 million people are said to have died in Europe out of a population of 100 million or so. It's a huge number. So imagine if 1 in 3 people next to you dies. Some estimates put it at 50%. So imagine if half of everyone next to you dies. That's what it was like. That has got to be insanely apocalyptic. You can't even wrap your head around that. You can't even imagine it, hardly. I mean, we just obviously went through COVID, which was, terrifying kind of pandemic, but I don't remember, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's not 1/3 of the population that died. I mean, if that was the case today, it'd be something like, 2 billion people that died, which is like, close to 2.5 billion people would be something close to a third of the population. Even worldwide, I mean, this wave of plague is said to have started in Asia around like 1330 AD, and over the course of the next 30 years, it made its way to Europe. And if you look at the entire like Eurasian sort of landmass, it's about 200 million people that die. So again, for the population numbers at the time, that's pretty crazy. There's probably about 1 billion people that live in the world at this time, and if 200 million of them die, that's a quarter of the population. Obviously, it doesn't get to the Americas, and it doesn't get to much of Africa. It does get to North Africa, but not significantly below the Sahara. So I really like to sort of mention this period just because I think it's so important for the development of the West or Europe subsequently. One of the interesting things about sort of doing archaeology of the plague or of the Black Death is that you do see the emergence of like plague hospitals, and a lot of good archaeology has been done on plague hospitals. There's this Italian word called lazaretto, which sort of is supposed to, it's sort of like a plague hospital. It's like a hospital, and so even concepts like quarantine, that word quarantine that we sometimes hear about, we're even supposed to quarantine during COVID, like staying inside. Um, that is a word that is sort of developed out of this period where there would be mandatory sort of isolation periods where you have to isolate for 40 days. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, and the word quarantine comes from the Italian word for 40. Anyway, a very apocalyptic thing. This led to all kinds of social upheaval. This more or less directly or indirectly leads to sort of the sort of collapse of the hold of power of the Catholic Church. This directly or indirectly leads to the fission in Western European Christianity, where you have the Reformation and the split between Protestants and Catholics. Much of like what we think of as sort of the rudiments of modern science develops out of this post-plague period. And kind of importantly, one thing we don't talk about that much is there's the Black Death, which specifically refers to this period like 1347 to 1351 or so. But then every 20 years or so, for the next 400 years, really, oftentimes in the major urban areas, another wave of plague comes through and wipes out, decimates the urban population. So it wasn't just like one event. This plague thing kept coming back for like 400 years, 500 years in some places. Okay, I do want to talk about another sort of critical event that's crucial and it's interesting to look at archaeologically. Maybe you don't hear about this in history class too much, but it's a really significant episode. It's what's sometimes referred to as the enclosures. This is the enclosures refers to. It's usually best to look at it. It really kicks off in modern day England or the UK if you want to, but more specifically England. And this is a period where gradually, well, it speeds up towards the end, but peasants are increasingly thrown off of their land, kicked off of their land, and more land is sort of privatized. Like literally, it's enclosed. Sometimes like literally with fences or hedges or, ditches or something like that. Like land that used to be sort of held in common that, you know, anyone could use like to graze their own sheep or to, you know, take some wood from or to like fish on a river or something like that. Increasingly, peasants are driven away from access to these common lands. And this land is sort of sealed off and privatized and becomes like owned by like one kind of aristocrat or noble or maybe upper middle class person. Um, there's a lot of reasons why this is pursued. The upper class had been kind of trying to do this since, say, the 14th century. And for the most part, the peasants, and in some cases, in, in connection with the actual king, are able to successfully sort of legally fend off the efforts of the aristocrats to enclose this land and privatize it and exclude peasants from access to it, exclude peasants from being able to access the resources on certain like parcels of land. The idea is that with this sort of transition, you can, when you enclose the land and sort of make it privately held, you can sort of maximize, if you're a farmer and you're trying to farm some land, if you sort of enclose it and sort of concentrate on just using it for farming or for grazing, you can really maximize the amount of like, calories and output that you can get from that land. When you have a community that's sort of sharing land in common, meaning that no one owns it and everyone has access to the resources on that land, it's true, you do not produce as much because you're sort of being a bit more sustainable. You have like rules in place that prevent over exploitation of certain lands and certain resources. Like, no matter where you go, like whether it's Europe or other parts of the world, nearly any society has customs and taboos and restrictions on how much like sort of timber you can take from the forest or how much fish you can catch or how many eggs you can take from a bird's nest. And all of those rules are in place to prevent the overexploitation, perhaps the extinction or the erosion of lands or species. So it's true. When you enclose the land and sort of focus any one of these sort of like parcels of land on strictly on the production of one crop, you can produce more. And so some people argue that this enclosure, the people who are like say this was a good thing, say things like, "Oh, we were able to sort of more efficiently maximize our output of the land." Yeah, sure, okay, yeah, if that's your goal, but who does that benefit? That benefits only the aristocrats and the nobles. It does not benefit the peasants. It hurts the peasants a lot because the crucial aspect of this enclosure period, which has really altered how we live our lives today, is that no longer could the common people or the peasants, provide for themselves. No longer could you or I be able to sustain ourselves legally, feed ourselves without money. Um, so this is the period in which you start needing to have money. And as you know, the way you get money is from working a job and getting paid a wage or a salary or something like that. So this is the period in which you sort of forced people off of the land and many times into urban areas. And if you wanted to be able to eat, you had to have money, which was sort of a change of pace. You used to be able to eat without having money, but now after this period, after sort of the land is taken away from the peasants and they can no longer grow their own food, and the land is sort of owned privately, um, if you want to eat, you have to have money because now what used to be food is now a commodity. And uh, so, like, at this point, when you privatize the land, you're sort of maximizing the output of the crops. You're not growing that wheat or grain to eat, you're growing it to sell. Um, so it's not really like, the food you're growing isn't really food anymore. It's a commodity because it's grown to be sold, not to be eaten. And ironically, or not really ironically, more like tragically, you do have a period in which there's increased output of agricultural supply, but you also have increased famines. People are starving because they can't afford food. They can't make their own. So like in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, you have increasing sort of episodes of famine. But you also have increased agricultural output. You just have people starving because this is a period in which food becomes like not food. It becomes a commodity. Like, when you're growing like corn or whatever it is, it's probably not corn, but when you're growing corn or something in the commons, you don't have to necessarily have money to consume it. But if you're growing corn on privatized enclosed land, you have to have money to consume it. Um, so a lot of people went starving during this transition to having to have money. It, and that's obviously still the world we live in where you have to have money to eat. And now at this point, by the year 2024, most of the planet Earth has been privatized. There are um, very few parcels of land in this world today that are still held in common, and certainly not enough to sort of feed the world's population today. So again, we have 1 billion people on the planet today that are malnourished or hungry. 1 billion. 1 billion people don't have enough food to eat. But that's not because we don't have enough food. There is more than enough food to feed everyone on this planet. So much food is thrown away. But the reason that 1 billion people are starving today is because they cannot afford to eat. It's not because there's not enough food. So we let 1 billion people go hungry um, because they can't afford to eat. Uh, that's the world we live in today. Anyway, as the story goes, and there is actually a lot of good archaeology about this enclosure period. Obviously, as you might imagine, you'd be happy to hear that this was resisted. The enclosure period was resisted strongly by peasants. I mean, again, they had been resisting it successfully since like the late 1300s and continued to, had succeeded fairly well up until the 1500s. But then by the 1600s, the uh, more or less the aristocrats, the nobles break down, eventually overcome peasant resistance, largely because the aristocrats and nobles and lords are able to sort of more or less get the king on their side. And, you know, efforts to enclose and privatize land had been like tried throughout the 1500s. And those cases were actually brought to legal proceedings. And usually the enclosures were found to be illegal. And so like the aristocrat was not able to do it. They'd say, oh, okay, your effort to enclose this plot of land has been found to be unlawful, and so you can't do it. But by the 1600s, that began to change, and the king was siding, or at least the courts were more often siding with the aristocrats and saying that they could enclose land. And by the end of the 1600s and into the 1700s, it's almost mandated to enclose land. So that century of the 1600s is one of great upheaval in England. This is also, you have the English Civil Wars, which are not unrelated to this. You have the Glorious Revolution. You have the rise, not unrelated also, of the Bank of England and the Lloyd's of London companies. And they are all implicated in sort of this normalization of the privatization of land. Sorry if I'm talking too fast, but feel free to email me about any questions you have about this. It's an interesting story to tell. What more do I want to say about this? Yes, this often is sort of this kicking people off of common land and does force them to move into the cities. And then you have sort of an urban explosion. This also is sort of feeds into the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk a little bit about, I believe, later. I think that's, I'm just kind of skipping through some of these ideas. I mean, it's definitely a period that I think a lot about, but I don't want to dwell on just reading these bullet points. If you want to have a look back at this, you can. One last thing I'll just say is there's commonly this idea, there's an idea that was sort of posed by this Garrett Hardin, this sort of economist researcher in the 1960s, called the tragedy of the commons. And his theory was that the commons don't work. The commons is this idea where you just don't, no one owns land, but everyone has access to the resources on this land. And so Garrett Hardin had this idea that like, eventually, always, any commons land would be overexploited because everyone will like, because they're always going to pursue their own best interests, will have a tendency to overexploit the land until like the land becomes ruined. And he called this the tragedy of the commons. And this was his theory about what happened to commons land. He is dead wrong. This tragedy of the commons is not something that's real. It's something that he invented. It's an idea, but it held so much, like it made so much sense to economists in like the 1960s and like just generally the 20th century that it became widely believed. There is no ethnographic evidence that suggests a tragedy of the commons thing ever really happened. Quite the contrary, like almost the exact opposite. Um, so his argument is sort of, he's arguing in favor of like private ownership of land because if you have like shared property, it'll be overexploited. And in fact, we find almost the exact opposite to be the case, that when you privately own land, you overexploit it. That's what we see with sort of the erosion of lands from over farming and from the um, over sort of use of pesticides and insecticides. You see land becoming increasingly degraded from privatization, because if you privatize it, you're going to try to maximize your wealth and you're going to overexploit it. Whereas in the common systems, you have rules. Like it's not like a free for all. It's not like total anarchy where you just go in there and you grab as much as you possibly can and get out. You live in a community of people who like abide by similar rules, and if you break those rules, you can be kicked out of the community and ostracized or punished. Um, uh, it's it's almost like, I mean, there's this belief among people like Garrett Hardin, and even if you go back to like Adam Smith or some of the early advocates for what we call capitalism, that there's this innate tendency for people to act in their own best interests. And that's just really just not true. That's like a sort of naturalized belief of people of like sort of a Western European colonial mindset. Um, yeah, beginning in sort of like the 1700s or so in Europe, most people, like it was almost became a law that like you should act in your own self-interest. You should try to maximize your own self-interest. That's kind of the idea of Adam Smith's sort of formulation of capitalism and the wealth of nations. But this is not a universal thing. And in fact, yeah, most people in most times have purposefully done things to prevent and minimize people acting selfishly and in their own best interest. The thing that's different or weird about the modern world or capitalism is that people acting selfishly has been kind of normalized as a good thing or like what you're supposed to do. That's weird. That's never happened before. That's like a totally new thing. That's like only Europeans of the past 300, 400 years have thought is normal or good. um, that's really not been the case. This tragedy of the commons thing is what would happen if you plopped down a bunch of modern people into a commons community. Um, that's because we're so normalized today to act in our like selfish best interest and take whatever we can that we would do this tragedy of the commons thing. But the people who, you know, grew up and were raised and lived in commons communities for generations did not have our mindset of just compulsively acting and out of selfish, egotistical best interests. So it's more like a kind of tragedy of the commodity than a tragedy of the commons, I like to say. Anyway, okay, let's stop there for now and call it a day on that one.